Welcome everyone, Bakhair Hatton. First, I would like to thank you all for taking the time to be here with us and joining the Zoom conference on reflections on peace building. To briefly introduce myself, my name is Hannah Srida, and I am a senior advisor to the peace building program at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University in the city of New York. And today's program, we will explore peace building initiatives specifically in the province of Kirkuk, an oil-rich province with diverse ethnic population, which its territory has been in contest between the federal government of Iraq and Kurdistan Regional Government. So for us, focus much of their attention on the elites and not much on the ground with the local communities. And therefore, significant meaningful changes have been made. So what can we do about this? Evidently, there are growing interest on peace-building initiatives geared towards a level that prove to make positive and meaningful changes. So for that, I'd like to draw upon LPI's work, Life and Peace Institute's initiative in Somalia by which they empowered many different Somali civil society groups and locals to achieve bottom-up community-based approach. The vision that drove these peace-building efforts in Somalia and sustained them over time included, one, strengthen the actors during peace processes in a way that enabled them to make meaningful contribution to peace building. And second, instill the philosophy of people-based sustainable peace building throughout. Sorry, I think we have one. If you could just mute your screen, that would be great. Thank you. So second is the instill philosophy of people-based sustainable peace building throughout all levels of society. Their motto was simple. They believe sustainable peace building starts at the community level and is a process that involves the entire society and not only the elites. And so in this program, we would like to explore such possibilities for Kirkuk and draw upon similar successful experiences. Now in our agenda, we will start by making meaning of peace building in the context of Kirkuk. So our first panel will start by explaining relevant local experiences in the diverse communities of the province. What are the obstacles and opportunities, and what are the way forward? Our panelists who are joining us from Kirkuk come from diverse backgrounds and work as journalists and civil activists. As for the second panel, we will explore what works and what doesn't. And our panelists are joining us from international organizations who will draw knowledge from best practices on international scale. Reflecting upon this discussion, Columbia University will then prepare an action plan proposing competent building measures and will explore working with local partners to institutionalize cooperation. Now, to begin this conference, I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Phillips, who's the director of the Peace Building Program. Mr. Phillips has a track record on understanding key issues in Kirkuk and has worked on Kurdish issues for more than 30 years. He's also the author of The Great Betrayal and The Kurdish Spring. Now, before we start, I'd like to tell our audiences that we have translation available for this Zoom conference. It's on the button on the right hand side. If you can see, it's called interpretation, and you can press Arabic if you would like to listen to it in Arabic. And also like to remind everybody that this session is recorded and later on will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. Now over to you, David, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Hannah. I'm very grateful to you, Hannah Sita, for your leadership in organizing today's conference. Also to Prusha Hasan, who works with us at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights. The two of you really did all the heavy lifting to organize the program today. So thanks very much for that. Before making remarks, I just want to acknowledge Dr. Nejmuddin Karim, the former governor of Kirkuk, who passed away last month. Dr. Karim and I have known each other for many decades, and without any hesitation, I can say that he's the embodiment of peace building. He believes in communication and cooperation. When he was governor, he sought to engage all of Kirkuk's communities, and his death is a great loss, not only to Kirkuk, but to Iraqi Kurdistan and Iraq and the entire world. He was truly a global citizen with enormous capacity. So we remember Governor Karim fondly today. I'm very pleased to try to define what peacebuilding means as a starting point. Before we think about initiatives to encourage peacebuilding, we really have to understand the term. Then we need to think about what structures are best suited to advance the goal of peacekeeping, how to engage local partners, because ultimately the responsibility for peacebuilding rests with them. So I'm going to start by establishing a definition for peacebuilding, which is a process that stabilizes war-torn societies and creates conditions for social repair and social harmony. Through contact, communication, and cooperation, former adversaries can develop empathy and mutual understanding, and this would lead to collaborative activities. Practical ways of working together advance shared interests and help to realize common goals, which is really the core principle of peacebuilding, recognizing that we have more interests in common than the differences that divide us. The term peacebuilding was first introduced in 1975 by a scholar named Johan Galtung. He defined peace as, quote, a capacity to transform conflicts with empathy, without violence, and creatively. Whereas peacemaking is an event that occurs on a specific day, such as the signing of a peace agreement. And we just celebrated the anniversary of the Dayton Peace Agreement that ended the war in Bosnia, something that Ambassador Galbraith is very familiar with. Galtung characterized peacebuilding in a different way. Rather than an event, it is, quote, a never-ending process. Peacebuilding is also a concept embraced by both policymakers and practitioners. UN Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali included peacebuilding in the United Nations 1992 Agenda for Peace. He focused on nonviolence in post-conflict societies as the basis for positive actions to consolidate sustainable peace. More than a social phenomenon, peacebuilding is also a personal process whereby the individual comes to view adversaries differently. It's something that occurs at a macro level within communities and countries, but also it's a highly personal process whereby each individual's view of himself, herself, and others is transformed. Instead of demonizing the other, mutual perceptions are transformed through interaction, which identifies common ground and finds practical forms of expression to advance the goal of reconciliation. Peacebuilding is a holistic approach aimed at fostering harmonious interrelations, which spans both political, economic, social, cultural, and the psychological dimensions. Peacebuilding is premised on security, the rule of law, and socio-economic development, not just the absence of armed conflict and violence. It's a positive expression for communities that have been ravaged by conflict and war as they turn the corner and develop closer and more cooperative relations. Peacebuilding is also served through social justice based on the principle of equal opportunity, a fair distribution of power and material resources, and equal protection through the rule of law. Though I quoted Dr. Galtung at the outset, I want to make clear that peacebuilding is much more than an academic concept. It has tangible and measurable outcomes that benefit individuals and society as a whole. Peace building is a transformative process which requires stewardship by both political and community leaders. So with this definition in mind, we've structured our discussion today to reflect the views of community leaders from Kirkuk, because ultimately the process of peace building resides with them. And then we're going to reflect on international experience in northern Iraq and elsewhere in Iraq as a way of informing the possibility for peace building in Kirkuk. So with that definition in mind, I give the floor to my colleague and friend Prusha Hasan, who will introduce and moderate the first panel. Prusha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As David mentioned, I'm Prusha Hasan. I'm the program assistant at Columbia's Peacebuilding and Human Rights program, and I'll be kicking off our first panel on community perspectives. As I'm sure many of you know, and as Hannah mentioned, community leaders and daily actions on behalf of normal citizens are critical to peace building. And today we're joined by a group of civil activists that have dedicated their time and energy to peace building in Kirkuk. We'll first hear from, and I'm going to ask that everyone mute their lines. I might be able to do it over here. Okay. Alrighty. All right, so we'll first hear from Mr. Hemin Hassib, who has been instrumental in developing this panel. He is the general director of SAT News, which is an outlet that specializes in news concerning Kirkuk and the disputed territories in northern Iraq. He is a member of the Global Network of Journalists and the International Association of Genocide Scholars. He served as the deputy director of Free Prisoners, which is an NGO based in Kirkuk, which specializes finding and identifying the remains of political prisoners killed by the Ba'athist regime. He was also a board member of the Kirkuk for Freedom of Kurdistan Youth Center. Our second panelist will be Mustafa Mahmoud Jassim, who was a former news director for TAT News Channel. He was previously a reporting photographer for Digital News Channel. He also worked as a logistics director and member of the human rights group within Iraqi Al-Amal Association. Then we'll hear from Enas Hassan. She is a correspondent to the Kirkuk Now Foundation. She previously worked with internally displaced persons at Iraqi Al-Amal Association. She has also worked as an analyst for the Building Peaceful Futures project, which was a collaboration between the Norwegian Council, Save the Children, and People with Disabilities Organization. She also worked as a social researcher for the Islamic Relief Organization, focusing on gender equality and violence against women at refugee camps in Iraq. Finally, last but definitely not least, we will hear from Odisho Ishi Georges, who is a Kirkuk-based news reporter for El Iraqi News Channel. He works as, currently works as a reporter for Kirkuk Satellite Channel, reporting on Assyrian affairs. He is also an Assyrian language teacher at a local elementary school and the head of the youth committee at his local church. So thank you all for joining us today. We have a really great roundup of speakers and much to learn. So without further ado, I will open the floor to Kak Hemin Fermo.
I think Kak Hemin's mic is not working.
Oh, it's not working. Okay, let's see. I'm seeing that Kak Hemin is on mute. Do you think he could?
مرحبا بكم. تشرفت بكم وسعيد أن أكون معكم في هذه الجلسة الحوارية. دورست هانا منها مقصة كان بكم دعي ورجير ترجمة كايا بش بوي
بله
لقصة كان
أتوانيها مقصة كانت كي
بله مرة ثانية مرحبا بكم وأتشرف أن أكون معكم في هذه الجلسة الحوارية حول موضوع بناء السلام في كركوك. أنا اسمي يمن حسيب، ولدت في عام 1986 في كركوك، ومنذ 34 سنة أنا ولدت ونشأت وأعيش حاليا في كركوك، ومن 2003 أعمل في مجالين الصحافة ومجال منظمات المجتمع المدني، وحاليا عضو الاتحاد الدولي للصحفيين وعضو الرابطة الدولية للناشطين في مجال الإبادة الجماعية، وعضو مشارك في مؤتمرات المحكمة الجنائية الدولية الذي ينعقد في لاهاي سنويا، وكل سنة أنا أشارك في هاي المؤتمر كاختصاصي في مجال كناشط في مجال مسائل حقوق الإنسان والإبادة الجماعية وجرائم الحرب. لا أريد أن أخذ من وقتكم أكثر. أنا أتطرق إلى موضوع اللي خصصته للتحدث فيها اليوم، وهو موضوع بناء السلام في كركوك. بصراحة يعني كركوك هو مدينة مشهورة بتنوع قومياته وأديانه، وهذه التنوع هو من أحد سمات الجمال المدينة. فمع الأسف المدينة يمكن يعني بتنوعها وجمالها هناك خلافات موجودة داخل المجتمع، أنا أتطرق إليها حاليا. لكن في البداية أقول إذا نريد أن ننظر إلى المجتمع الكركوكي لازم ننظر إليها من منظورين: المنظور السياسي والمنظور المجتمعي، لأن الخلافات عميقة في المنظور السياسي داخل الطبقة السياسية والأحزاب السياسية، لكن في منظور المجتمعي داخل المجتمع ومكونات وأهل المدينة نجد خلافات أقل من هذا. لذا أنا أتطرق إلى الموضوع من نقطة ثانية، وهو المنظور المجتمعي، المنظور الكثافة السكانية أو مكونات المدينة. يعني في الواقع الخلافات داخل مكونات كركوك كمواطن عادي، كل واحد يعيش في المدينة موظفا أو عنده محل أو عنده أي وسيلة للعيش، نرى أن الخلافات خلافات قليلة، ليس هناك خلافات عميقة، ليس هناك خلافات عميقة أو خلافات حادة مثل ما نجدها في وسط الطبقة السياسية. وهذه التماسك الموجود داخل المجتمع يعود إلى سببين. السبب الأول القيم والعادات التقاليد المتمسك بها كل مكون حسب اعتقاده وحسب عادته التقاليد. والنقطة الثانية هو ولود شعور يم مكونات المدينة بأن المتضرر الوحيد من أي سوء في المدينة هو الشعب الكركوكي. فهاي تولد هاي الشعور شيء جيد، يعني أنا أراها شيء جيد بأن كل واحد يرى بأن المتضرر الوحيد في سوء المدينة أو تحول المدينة إلى مكان أو بؤرة سيئة هو المتضرر الوحيد هو أهل المدينة والسكان المدينة وليس السياسيين والأحزاب. والنقطة الأولى كما قلنا هو القيم والعادات الاجتماعية المتمسك بها كل مكون حسب عادات قوميته أو ديانته. لكن هذه النقطتين المهمتين لازم لا نتركه كما هو، يجب علينا استثمارها، استثمار هذه النقطتين، النقطة الاجتماعية والنقطة ولود الشعور بأن المتضرر الوحيد هو أهل المدينة. فعلينا من هذه النقطة استثمارها. فكيف نستثمر هذه النقطة؟ أولا علينا عمل على تحقيق عدالة والمساواة بين أبناء المجتمع، والنظر إلى أبناء الكركوك ككركوكية وليس ككرديا أو عربيا أو تركمانيا. فمثلا في مجال الاقتصاد، في مجال فرص العمل، في مجال الثقافة، في مجال الفنون، يجب أن نحقق عدالة والمساواة، وبأن ننظر كل واحد منا إلى الآخر كنظرة كركوكية وليس نظرة قومية أو نظرة دينية. وهذه التحقيق هذه العدالة والمساواة يحتاج إلى دور منظمات المجتمع المدني والسفارات الدول المتقدمة كالسفارة الأمريكية والسفارة الدول الأوروبية التي لديهم خبرة في هذا المجال، أن يكونوا لهم تجاوب ميداني في كركوك. مع الأسف يعني كركوك حاليا خالية من وجود أي سفارات داخل المدينة، فلو كان كركوك مثل أربيل فيها تواجد سفارات لكان تطور القيمي وتطور المجتمعي كان أكثر، وكان يعني انفتاح أكثر بالنسبة للمجتمعات الأوروبية والمجتمعات الأمريكية، وإضافة إلى هناك غياب واضح لمنظمات المجتمع الدولي. المنظمات المجتمع الدولي اللي يعمل حاليا في كركوك أكثر من ذلك منظمات اللي يعمل في مجال النازحين، أو يعني الناجحين بالنسبة للنزوح الذي حصل بسبب نتيجة حرب داعش. ولا يوجد منظمات يعمل في مجال الثقافة أو مجال الفنون أو تنمية قدرات الشباب أو تنمية قدرات النساء. فهاي عندنا هاي الإشكالية. وإذا نظرنا إلى الطبقة السياسية، فنحن يعني إذا نظرنا إلى كركوك من منظور السياسي، فنرى أن هناك خلافات عميقة، خلافات عميقة وصلت إلى نقطة لا يعني لا يوجد حل لها. فأنا أرى أن الخلاف العميق الموجود داخل الطبقة السياسية هو لأن الأحزاب المتواجدة بكركوك لا ينظرون إلى كركوك بنظرة كركوكية، وإنما ينظرون كل واحد منهم بحسب رؤية سياسية ما لديه. فمثلا الأحزاب الكردية ينظر إلى كركوك بالعقلية الذي يتعامل بها مع اقليم كردستان في سليمانيه او اربيل، والاحزاب العربيه تتعامل مع كركوك كما يتعامل مع انبار او بغداد او بصره، والاحزاب التركمانيه ينظر الى كركوك كما بنظره تركيه او بنظره التي تقام في انقره. فهاي المشكله اللي احنا عندنا في كركوك من الطبقه السياسيه. خلاف حاد لانهم لا ينظرون الى كركوك بالنظره الكركوكيه. لذا لحل هاي المشكله انا ارى بأن يكون لكركوك وضع خاص، يعني إقليم، منطقة حكم ذاتية، ولاية مبسطة، بحيث لا يكون لقرارات بغداد أو لقرارات إقليم كردستان أربيل تأثير على كركوك، وإن يكون لكركوك هو أن يصدر القرار عن مصيرها، عن إدارتها، عن أعمال اليومية، عن المشاريع الاقتصادية، عن المشاريع الاستثمارية في مجال الثقافة، وأن يكون هناك إدارة مشتركة. أنا أستند في هذا الموضوع إلى نقطة مهمة كان لنا بها تجربة. في فترة من 2011 إلى 2014 كان هناك إدارة مشتركة بين مكونات كركوك، فكان السلطة التنفيذية الأولى بيد الكرد، الله يرحمها كان دكتور نجم الدين هو مدير السلطة التنفيذية، والسلطة التشريعية الأولى بيد التركمان، والسلطة التنفيذية الثانية بيد العرب. فكان لنا نرى في أن في هذه الفترة هناك إدارة مشتركة، قرارات سليمة تدرس تصدر، وأن كانت في فترة كركوك تنعم بأمان أمني واقتصادي وسياسي وإداري. لكن مع الأسف هاي الإدارة المشتركة بعد 2014 ومجيء داعش انخلل فيها ولم يبقى هاي الإدارة المشتركة. ومرة ثانية عاد العقلية الحزبية الضيقة في مجال السياسة. ولا ننسى بأن الخطابات السياسية والأحزاب السياسية لها تأثير عميق على المجتمع الكركوكي. يعني الخلافات اللي أنا تكلمت من البداية بأن المجتمع الكركوكي كالمجتمع ليس بها خلافات حادة إلا خلافات بسيطة، وهذه الخلافات البسيطة نتيجة للخطابات السياسية التي يصدرها الأحزاب السياسية. فمثلا يعني في موضوع انتخابات نرى بأن الحزب يرفع شعار صوتوا لي، لأن إن لم تصوتوا لي فإن الذئاب سيأكلكم. فهذه شعار عنصري، شعار طائفي خطير، ولا يوجد رقابة تشريعية أو رقابة من قبل اللجنة اللي تنظم الانتخابات أن تمنع أو تحظر هاي الحزب. فأنا أرى بأن علينا أن نعمل بجدية على مستويين: المستوى المجتمعي، التماسك اللي موجود وهو القيم والعادات والشعور اللي ولد يوم المجتمع بأن المتضرر الوحيد من أي سوء هو الكركوكي، فعلينا استثمار عليها. لأن يعني في المدينة حاليا الشاب ما عنده وسائل للحياة، ما عنده وسائل للترفيهية، ما عنده حدائق يروح إليها. دور تواجد السفارات والمنظمات الدولية في هذه البقعة يكون لها دور كثير في استثمار هاي الشعور اللي موجود داخل المجتمع. وفي مجال السياسي يجب أن يوضع قاعدة أساسية للأحزاب السياسية، ويوضع قوانين حتى يحدد من تلك الخطابات التي لم تنزف منها سوى السوء وسوى التطرف وسوى العنصرية. وشكرا.
Thank you, Kak Hemin Hassib. We will next move on to, sorry. Okay, next we will move on to our next speaker. Mustafa, I believe you have the floor. Mustafa, can you hear us all right?
مرحبا، أسمعكم بس
We
عيدوا
can
بس
hear you.
آخر جملة بالعربي. ألو تسمعوني؟
Yep, we can hear you. If you could just translate that he now has the floor.
Sorry, give me 1 second. The translator got muted, so. Okay, here we go.
ألو، صوتي وصلكم جماعة؟
نعم مصطفى، يوصل صوتك.
هسه أبلش إن شاء الله.
نعم تكلم تفضل.
بس سؤالي كان إنه الكلام جرة واحدة أقوله يترجم له أقف كل موضوع.
لا مثل ما أنا تكلمت جرة واحدة تتكلم عن الموضوع بالكامل.
تمام. أولا مرحبا بكم جميعا. أنا اسمي مصطفى محمود من مدينة كركوك. كنت أعمل في مجال الصحافة بعدها حقوق الإنسان. الآن أعمل في مجال التنمية الزراعية في مدينة كركوك. بعدها عملت عدة أعمال. نجي أريد أتكلم يعني كمواطن كركوكي المعاناة اللي يواجهنا في مجال حقوق الإنسان. النقطة الأولى إنه ما نقدر المنظمات المحلية ما نقدر نقول 100%، لكن نسبة مرتفعة من عندها مرتبطة بأحزاب سياسية. مثلا إحنا من نريد نعمل أي عمل كأشخاص فرديين وجماعات مسالمة لا نصل إلى نتيجة موافقات أمنية ما نحصل. يعني هاي أكثر مشكلة اللي أنا أعاني من عندها، أنا ما قاعد أحصل موافقات أمنية إنه نشتغل داخل مدينة كركوك. مشكلة ثانية اللي موجودة في كركوك نسبتها حاليا صار قليلة، إنه اتحاد الطلبات التابع للأحزاب السياسية هم ساحبين جمهور كركوك كانوا. يعني اتحاد الطلبة مثلا كل حزب أو كل قومية عنده أكثر من اتحاد طلبة وشباب، فهذول النسبة عالية من عندهم يسحبونهم إلى دوامة الطائفية. لكن أعتقد أنا خلال هاي السنوات الأخيرة، سنتين الأخيرة، الناس قامت توعى إنه هذا الأحزاب ما يوصلون للنتيجة. الناس قامت تدور المادة أكثر من الحزب أو قوميته. يعني هاي شيء إيجابي. أحد التجارب اللي شفناه إنه صارت في مدينة كركوك أقل مشاكلاً، يعني يصير بالدورات اللي يحثونهم على التعليم الصنعي دخولهم إلى سوق العمل. يعني هاي التجربة اللي نجحت عندنا. وبعدها أريد أضيف المشاكل اللي قاعد يواجهنا إنه في وقت الحالي أنا أحكي لكم إنه ما نحصل موافقات أمنية نعمل. يعني مثلا من نعمل مبادرات سلام أو من نعمل مبادرات خيرية نتعرض للاعتقال. يعني أنا من الأشخاص قبل 20 يوم مبادرة زراعية أسوي يتم توقيفي ويتم وسيلة النقل اللي أنا أنتقل به يتم توقيفه 20 يوم ونحال إلى المحاكم. يعني صراحة هذا اللي أنا أشوفه واللي صار وياي. والنقطة الأخرى اللي ردت أنوه عنها إنه النقطة اللي ردت، فهذه الشغلات اللي وصلنا له. وقبل من نهاية 2014 نسبة الذين كانوا يحملون الفكر الديني، الطائفة الدينية وليس القومية، كانت مرتفعة عندهم. جزء من كركوك كانت تحت احتلال داعش. صراحة النظرة الكراهية كان عندهم كلش عالية باتجاه داخل المدينة. كانوا يفكرون أنهم من يدخلون يسبون أو السرقات على باسم الدين يكون. لكن على مر الأيام اكتشفوا أنهم على طريق الغلط، على بعد ما عبروا إلى داخل مدينة كركوك أو إلى إقليم كردستان شافوا التطور الموجود اللي عندهم، هذا التطور العمراني والثقافي نوعا ما، قام النسبة مالهم أحب أنه أختصر الكلام، يعني خير الكلام ما قل ودل. لكن الآن مدينة كركوك تحتاج إلى توجيه الشباب لدخول سوق العمل. من يتوجهون إلى سوق العمل تفكيرهم يعني يكون مصدر الرزق، تطوير الذات، تطوير الفكر، فهاي الشغلات يخليهم يكونون بعيدين عن السياسات. وحاليا يعني صراحة مع الأسف في النظام السابق كان يوجد سياسة تعريب، وبعدها سياسة تكريد، والآن هم رجع سياسة تعريب. يعني هاي المشاكل احنا قاعد نواجهها. الشاب الكركوكي حاليا عنده مشكلة اقتصادية، مدينة نفطية لكن لا يوجد فيها مصافي، لا يوجد فيها مشتقات نفطية، يعني شركات إنتاج ضخمة يستوعب أيدي عاملة كركوك. والمشكلة اللي نواجهها بالشباب كشباب إنه نشوف إنه الشركات اللي يجي يسوي استثمار من كركوك أيدي العاملة أقل من 50% تكون بمدينة كركوك وليس 100%. يعني هذا كله قاعد يأثر علينا. هاي النقاط اللي يعني المشاكل الأساسية اللي احنا قاعد نواجهها. نحن لا نقول الآن 100% أمان، لكن نوعا ما نكون مطمئنين من عدم تواجد داعش قريب علينا بعد ما تحررت الحويجة والمناطق أطراف حويجة. المشكلة الأخرى اللي يواجه كمدينة كركوك حاليا إنه تعرفون إنه نسبة عالية من عندهم كانوا يسكنون في حويجة أو أطرافها، صار عندهم أطفال وصار عندهم تزاوج، لكن الحكومة الحالية بصعوبة يعترف بهذا النقاط. هاي النقاط يعني إنه الزواج خارج المحكمة ما يعترفون به، أطفال صايرة بدون جنسية، أطفال يعني في الوقت الحالي هم في الشوارع، قاموا إنه يعملون في ترافيك لايتات، تقول لهم وين جنسيتك؟ تقول أنا حاليا ما عندي جنسية لأن أنا ولدت في زمن داعش خلال هاي 4-5 سنوات، يعني عمر 3 سنوات 4 سنوات هم في الشوارع، يتعرضون للتحرش، يتعرضون للمشاكل يعني اكثر مما تتصورونه، يعني مثل الاغتصاب وهاي الشغلات. واغلبيه برا يعني اكو اطفال انه ابوهم ما معترف بيهم وامهم هم ذابتهم، حاليا هم يكونون مثل قنبله موقوته للمستقبل. هاي المشكله الاساسيه اللي عندنا، يعني احنا لازم نفكر البعيد، لازم نخلي الخطه 50 وخطه 20 احنا كيف نقضي على الارهاب في المستقبل. هذول كلهم راح يعيدون لنا مجاميع كذئاب مفترسه يدخلون الكركوك. ابسط شيء، هاي الطفل من تساله منو قتل ابوك يقول لك الجيش قتل ابويا، الشرطه قتل ابويا، بيشمرك قتل ابويا، او التحالف الدولي. في نظرهم الجيش والشرطه والتحالف الدولي ارهاب يعتبرون، فراح يعيدون انتقامهم. حاليا عمرهم 5 سنوات، بعد 10 سنوات يكون 15 سنه، يكون مراهق. امكانيه وصول السلاح في اطراف مدينه كركوك سهله جدا، يعني من السهوله يقدر يحصل سلاح لان يعني مناطق ريفيه، فهذا راح يسبب لنا مشاكل. هاي النقاط يعني اللي شفتها يعني بالمستقبل راح هذا الشيء يسبب لنا مشاكل، وعدم الجنسيه هم يسبب لنا مشاكل. هاي النقاط اللي حبيت فقط اوضح لكم اياها.
شكرا.
اهلا.
ست بروشا طابو.
Thank you, Mustafa. Next, we'll hear from Enas. Enas, you have the floor.
يس شكرا. أنا إناس الحسن من محافظة كركوك، طالبة كلية تربية أساسية قسم اللغة الإنجليزية. حاليا أعمل مع مؤسسة كركوك ناو في كتابة التقارير الصحفية وعلى المناطق اللي متنازع عليها. في تقاريرنا دائما تكون مختصة في عمليات بناء السلام ونبذ خطاب الكراهية وحقوق المرأة وحقوق الإنسان بشكل عام. أحد المشاكل اللي أحب أتحدث عنها باختصار أتحدث عن 3 إلى 4 مشاكل إذا الوقت أسعفني. أول أحد المشاكل اللي نعاني منها في محافظة كركوك هي عدم وجود دور إيواء للنساء المعنفات من قبل أزواجهم أو من قبل أهلهم أو من قبل أي جهة أخرى. هذا يسبب زيادة بالصراعات والنزاعات اللي تحدث بالمجتمع. فبرأيي أحد الحلول اللي ممكن إنه إحنا نحاول نستنتجها ممكن إنه نقوم بعمل دار إيواء للنساء، فاللي تتعرض للعنف ممكن تقدر تتجه لهذا الدار فبدال ما احنا نروح أربيل أو نروح بغداد على مود إنه تحافظ على نفسها من العنف، فممكن إنه داخل محافظة كركوك تبقى وتحافظ على نفسها أيضا. هاي أحد المشاكل. مشكلة أخرى عندنا، أكو بعض الأشخاص بشكل عام عندهم فهم خاطئ لبعض الديانات، لطقوس بعض الديانات. مثلا أحد الأشخاص يقول مثلا الديانة الأزيدية يعبدون الشيطان، أو الديانة الزردشتية عندهم الليلة المظلمة، أو ما أعرف شنو هواي أمور. فجهل كلش كبير بالمجتمع بخصوص طقوس الديانات. فإحنا نحتاج كأشخاص نحاول نلاقي حلول لهذه المشاكل. فأحد الحلول بالنسبة لي لهالمشاكل هو إنه نسوي فيديو مكون من 3 دقائق. أول بداية الفيديو يتحدث عن الأمور السلبية اللي الناس فاهمتها بالمجتمع بطريقة خاطئة عن هاي الديانات، وخلال دقيقتين الباقية نقدر نوضح الأمور الصحيحة. يعني نسوي ميكس بين الأمور الغلط وبين الأمور الصحيحة حتى تبين بشكل أوضح للمجتمع وللناس، وننشرها على مواقع السوشيال ميديا أو أي مواقع أخرى حتى ممكن تكون عالمية. شغلة أخرى أيضا، أحد الحلول اللي ممكن إحنا نقترحها لهاي المشكلة إنه نزور الأماكن المقدسة لهاي الديانات، ونحاول نسوي مثلا نبرز الشغلات الإيجابية اللي بالديانات مالتهم. يعني بدال أني ما أتحدث عن الأمور السلبية في الديانة المسيحية عفوا، أو مثلا الأزيدية أو اليهودية أو أي ديانة أخرى أو حتى الإسلامية، أني أقدر أبرز الأمور الإيجابية مالتهم، وأقدر أستثمرها بعمل شيء إيجابي بالمجتمع، وأحاول أنشر شغلات إيجابية عنهم حتى أبتعد عن خطابات الكراهية، وأبتعد عن الصراعات والنزاعات اللي تصير بين أبناء المجتمع. أو ممكن أحد الحلول الثالثة اللي ممكن يكون إنه ممكن نسوي ورش تدريبية لمختلف الشباب، يعني من مختلف الديانات. نحاول نجمعهم في ورشة تدريبية معينة لعمل معين، أو لعمل نشاطات أو مبادرات مشتركة بيناتهم. هذا الشيء أيضا راح يزيد من الاحتكاك، ويقلل من نسبة الصراعات والنزاعات اللي داية تصير، ونحاول نطلع بحلول منطقية أكثر في المجتمع. عندي مشكلة ثالثة أيضا أحب أحكي به، اللي هو الحكم المسبق على النساء العاملات. يعني مثلا أنا كبنية أطلع للشغل، أرجع ساعة متأخرة، أو ممكن أروح فد مكان معين لسبب ما، لشغل مضطرة يعني بسبب العمل. فالناس تاخذها بنظرة أخرى، مثلا إنه المرأة العاملة دائما تتعرض للتنمر، تتعرض لضغوطات مجتمعية بسبب عادات معينة وتقاليد وهكذا أمور. فأحب مثلا نلاقي حلول لهاي المشكلة. فأني بدال ما أتعرض للتنمر والسب والشتم والقذف، مثلا نقول يعني نحاول نحل هاي المشكلة، اللي هو ممكن إنه نسوي مسرحية صامتة بين مجموعة بنات أو شباب أو أي أشخاص يقدرون يسوونها، نبرز بيها الشغلات الإيجابية أثناء خروج المرأة للعمل، وشنو هي فائدتها بالمجتمع، ومدى تأثيرها علينا كأشخاص بشكل عام بالحياة وبالعالم، يعني كامرأة عاملة. أو نقدر نسوي جلسات مشتركة بين النساء وبين الرجال، وخصوصا الرجال اللي يسبون ويشتمون النساء اللي يطلعون يشتغلون. فمثلا نسوي لهم جلسة معينة حوارية، ونبرز أبرز المحاور للجلسة، إنه شنو هو الشغلات اللي ممكن تكون مشتركة بيناتهم، وشنو الشغلات اللي تكون نقدر نعالجها، ونطلع بمخرجات جيدة بالجلسة، ونحاول نقلل من هيك ظواهر حتى يعني نبرز إنه المرأة لها حقوق معينة، ومن حق أو أحد حقوقها هو العمل. فكلش طبيعي، يعني ماكو إشكال إذا اشتغلت أو طلعت في مكان معين. وتقريبا هاي كل المشاكل اللي أحب أتحدث عنها، وشكرا لكم على هاي الجلسة اللي راح تكون، أتمنى تكون مفيدة أكثر، نطلع بحلول منطقية تفيد محافظة كركوك في عملية بناء السلام.
Thank you very much, Enas, for your very, very insightful comments. Last but not least, Kak Odisho, please unmute your line and you have the floor.
أستاذ أوديشو تفضل.
I think he'll have to unmute his line if he can.
أستاذ أوديشو تفضل تكلم.
تسمعوني؟
نعم نسمع.
أوكي. من حسن الحظ انقطعت المولدة، تشوفون يمكن هسه الجو مظلم. هاي أجواء مدينة كركوك، 4 ساعات مولدة وماكو كهرباء، وهسه طفى المولدة، وهذا من حظنا. اسمي عوديشو إيشي غورغيس. عملت في الفضائية العراقية كركوك. سابقا عملت في راديو أربخا. أيضا عملت في مكتب علاقات كركوك. أيضا حاليا مذيع أخبار الآشورية في تلفزيون كركوك، ومعلم اللغة الأم اللغة الآشورية في مدرسة أنستاس الكرملي. بالنسبة لي ممكن أنه راح أقرأ الشيء اللي حضرته إذا أكو مجال، ممكن يعني فد 10 دقائق تقريبا. تتمثل عملية بناء السلام بالنسبة لي في تعزيز قبول الآخر والابتعاد عن التشنجات الطائفية التي من شأنها زعزعة الاستقرار في مدينة كركوك، وتوفير فرص العيش الكريم للمواطنين، لأن معظم الأمور التي تضرب السلام تكون ناتجة من العوز المادي. هناك أفكار وثوابت عديدة عند فئات مختلفة في المجتمع ليس من السهل تغييرها، أفكار وقناعات أيديولوجية، كذلك قلة الانفتاح لدى بعض الشرائح، ما يؤدي إلى الانغلاق وعدم تقبل الجديد. دائما ما أدعو عن طريق وسائل التواصل إلى نبذ الكراهية وزيادة التسامح، وميدانيا عن طريق الفضائية أو في المدرسة أو عن طريق الكنيسة. من وجهة نظري يستطيع المجتمع الدولي والجامعة الكولومبية في دعم أشخاص أو منظمات داخل كركوك، وذلك لتوفير فرص عمل وتعزيز ارتباط الشخص بالمجتمع وتغذيته بعدة طرق، كفتح صحف أو مجلات توعوية وبلغات قوميات كركوك كي تصل الجميع دون تمييز. من وجهة نظر مواطن مسيحي في كركوك، أعتقد أن تفعيل وزيادة مبادئ السلام في هذه المدينة يكمن في عدة نقاط. بالنسبة للخطاب الطائفي، يعتبر منبوذ صراحة في هذه المدينة، ولكن أعني بين التحريض بين الأديان، ولكن هذا لا يعني ظهور خطابات متشددة بين الفئة والأخرى، تكثر أحيانا في فترات معينة كاقتراب أعياد الميلاد أو رأس السنة، حيث أتذكر أنه في عيد الميلاد 2015 أو 14 15 16 كان من الصعب علينا أن نجد شجرة ميلاد في كركوك. يعني كل الأسواق ما كنا نستطيع أن نجد هذه الشجرة، ولكن هذه الظاهرة قلت الآن منذ عدة سنوات، منذ تحرير جنوب وغرب كركوك من تنظيم داعش. كذلك كان من الصعوبة علينا أن نجد الصلبان الذهبية، حيث من عاداتنا وتقاليدنا كمسيحيين أنه في الزواج أو الخطبة يحضر العريس إلى عروسته الذهب، وأهم قطعة في هذا الذهب هو الصليب الذهبي. هذه الظاهرة تناقصت، ربما تكاد تتلاشى، وما يمنع تلاشيها وبعض التصريحات المسيحيين في العراق عامة وفي كركوك خاصة ندعو إلى المساواة، حيث تعتبر المساواة من أهم القيم والأسباب التي تعزز الشعور بالانتماء وتقلل الخطاب الطائفي، ما يؤدي إلى تعزيز السلام في مدينة ذات طابع خاص، ألا وهو التعددية في القوميات والأديان والمذاهب. المساواة التي تنادي بها دائما أو ننادي بها كمسيحيين. على سبيل المثال نطالب دائما في كركوك بالمساواة في قضية التعيينات، حيث يجب أن يكون هناك مراعاة لنا كمكون أصيل وشعب أصيل في هذه الأرض. على سبيل المثال عندنا في كركوك هناك نسبة معروفة سابقة وهي 32% العرب، وكذلك التركمان والكرد، و4% لنا كمسيحيين. ولكن في حقيقة الأمر عندما تكون هناك تعيينات نلاحظ عدم وجود التزام بنسبة 4% الخاصة بالمسيحيين. كمثال، حيث قبل أشهر قليلة حدثت تعيينات على ملاك تربية كركوك، وكانت هناك 2848 درجة، متصور يعني أكثر من 2800 درجة، وحيث تكون نسبة 4% من 2800 حوالي 113 درجة، لكن فوجئنا بوجود 5 درجات فقط للمسيحيين، 5 من 2800. هناك يجب علينا أن نقف ونتأمل في هذه الأمور المهمة التي من شأنها أن تزيد السلام، وكذلك من شأنها تقضي على أو تزيد التعايش السلمي، يعني عندما تكون هناك مساواة بين المكونات. كذلك بخصوص المناصب في الدوائر الحكومية في المدينة، حيث دائما بسبب التقاعد أو بسبب استقالة الموظفين المسيحيين لا نجد من يعوضهم في أماكنهم. وكذلك بالنسبة للتعامل الحكومي يتعده إلى جهات أخرى، يعني ينبغي أن تكون أكثر سلاسة وتنظر بنظر اعتبار إلى التعايش والتوازن، مثل منظمات المجتمع المدني، حيث نلاحظ قلة الاهتمام والاكتراث بأمور وقضايا المسيحيين، وحتى في عملية التشغيل المسيحيين داخل تلك المنظمات. يعني حتى منظمات المجتمع المدني كما اتطرق والأخوة أنها مسيسة أو ربما أو متحزبة إن صح التعبير، لا تولي أهمية كبيرة بنا كمكون مسيحي. أنا أتكلم عن نفسي، عن كركوك، وأنا مواطن مسيحي فيها. كذلك هناك موضوع مهم جدا، ولا هو موضوع الهجرة أو نزيف الهجرة الذي ضرب المسيحيين بشكل خاص، حيث إذا علمنا أن المسيحيين كانوا في عام 2003 أكثر من 1,250,000 نسمة، بينما لا يتعدد عدد اليوم بين 250 إلى 300,000 نسمة في كل العراق. إن بناء السلام في مدينة كركوك سيكون له دافع كبير على بقاء العوائل الباقية، لأن اجتثاث أو نفاذ مكون كامل في مدينة يعني الكثير من المشاكل التي ربما ستظهر مستقبلا، ولا نستبعد حصول مثل هذا الأمر مع مكون آخر في كركوك لا قدر الله. يعني اختفاء أو تناقص أو نستطيع أن نقول انقراض مكون، هي عملية يعني إبادة صراحة ما تعرض له المسيحيين في العراق عموما، وفي كركوك بشكل يعني الهجرة أثرت، والهجرة لها أسباب كثيرة طبعا، لأن أحد الأسباب هو عدم الشعور بالمساواة بيني وبين المواطن الآخر في المدينة، وهذا غالبا ما يؤدي إلى الهجرة يعني لدى المسيحيين. هناك العديد من الطرق لبناء السلام في كركوك، كتخفيض أو تجريم التحريض الطائفي الديني والمذهبي، كذلك القومي، سواء كان هذا التحريض من جهات للأسف هي دينية، ونلاحظ بوضوح أكبر قبل تحرير جنوب وغرب كركوك من تنظيم داعش، لكن لا زال اليوم العديد من المروجين لتلك الأفكار العدائية، ولا يخفى وجود خلايا نائمة باقية في مناطق كركوك. إخوتي لنكون أكثر صراحة. ربما يقول قائل أن بعض ما ذكرته متعلق بفساد حكومي ونحن نتحدث عن المجتمع. هنا أريد أن أوضح شيئا، أكرر مرة أخرى لنكون أكثر صراحة. فالحكومات ما هي إلا من المجتمع، وما الحكومات إلا وليدة المجتمع وجاءت بأصوات المجتمع. فلو مرض المجتمع مرضت الحكومات والعكس صحيح. في النهاية أدعو الجميع إلى العمل لأجل عدم النظر إلى المكون المسيحي أو المسيحيين في المجتمع على أنهم مواطنون من الدرجة الثانية. تلك النظرة الوريثة منذ 500 عام على الأقل، أي من فترة سيطرة العثمانيين على العراق وكركوك خاصة، والنظرة الدونية لهم بخصوص كل ما هو مختلف عنهم لا سيما الدين، لتأتي بعدها العصبية العربية واعتبار المسيحيين موالين للإنجليز، وما مذابح سميل 1933 خير شاهد على تلك الفترة، ثم مذابح سوريا وفي زمن الجمهورية، ثم مذبحة سيدة النجاة في عصر الانفتاح والإنترنت. نسألكم أن نعمل جميعا لإذابة تلك النظرة، فنحن مكون أصيل والسكان الأصليين لهذا البلد. شكرا جزيلا، وأعتذر عن الصورة لأنه لا وجود للكهرباء، وأعتقد هذه الصورة ستوضح الكثير لكم عن حال مدينة كركوك. يعني الساعة 5 المولدة تعمل 4 ساعات وخلص استراحتها، والكهرباء الوطنية أو الحكومية غير موجودة. هذا حالنا في كركوك. شكرا جزيلا. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaka Odisho, and all of our panelists. Thank you for your very thoughtful input. As many of you noted, we must employ a multi-pronged approach if we want lasting peace in Kirkuk, and that is an approach that includes NGOs, that includes women and individuals from all backgrounds. So thank you again for your participation. If any of our audience have any questions, please feel free to pop it in the chat box.
I think Prusha's screen froze. I think I'm going to take it over from here. Thank you very much, Prusha, and thank you to our panelists for sharing their input and their personal experiences. Now we turn into our second panel, to our international commentary, what works and what doesn't. And for this panel, we invite our speakers to share their perspectives. And to briefly introduce you to them, we have Ambassador Peter Galbraith. He is a former US ambassador and senior staff to Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He acted as an informal advisor to the Kurdistan regional government and helped influence the drafting process of the Iraqi constitution in 2005. He'll be speaking about an international perspective on peace building. And our second panelist, we have Kaksar Hamasaid. He's a director of the Middle East programs at the US Institute of Peace. His work focuses on political and policy analysis and peace building in Iraq and MENA region. He also serves as a member of task force on the future of Iraq. He'll be speaking about peace building as a tool for resolving political disputes in Iraq. And last but not least, we have Nahib Hegel. She is a senior analyst at ICG, International Crisis Group. Her work focuses on Iraq and Kurdistan region. She's previously worked on mediation efforts for the Dialogue Advisory Group, focusing on Kirkuk. She'll be talking about administrative arrangement for peace building, Kirkuk municipality and Kirkuk government and the federal government. With that, I open the floor to Ambassador Galbraith.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel on the important question of Kirkuk. I'd like to say a special thanks to David Phillips for the work that he's been doing for 30 years on the Kurdish question and the enormous expertise that he has. I also want to say a word about my friend Najmuddin Karim, whom I met 33 years ago, and who's really the person who educated me about Kurdistan. I listened to the previous panel, and a little bit hard to follow because of the, if you don't have sharp ears, because of the hearing both the translation and the original. But as I listened to Kak Hemin, I could hear the discussion about a culture in which political party surpasses everything else. And I'm sorry to say that this is something that is true in other countries. Today in the United States, the Republican Party seems to value the party more than the process of democracy and refuses to acknowledge the indisputable result of an election in the world's oldest continuous democracy. In Britain, the Conservative Party has been more focused on Brexit than on keeping the United Kingdom together, and has embarked on a course of action that will lead to Scotland's separation. And in Iraq, you could see political parties more focused on their political agenda, on power, than on the country or on Kurdistan. So it's a broad phenomena. In my post-diplomatic life, I was in politics. I won a couple of elections, and I lost an election. And what I can say is, power isn't everything. And power, in fact, power is one thing, but there's plenty in life if you don't have it, if you lose an election. And so one thing I would say about Najmuddin Karim is that he never put political party first. He was a member of a political party, the PUK, but as governor of Kirkuk, he put the people of Kirkuk first. And in fact, in many ways, he put them ahead of the sort of broader question of Kurdistan. He was determined to represent all communities, and he focused on the very issues that I heard the previous panel discussing. Issues of electricity, of education, of women, and so much else. And I had the pleasure of visiting with him a couple of times. I first visit to Kirkuk was 1987, actually the same year I met Najmuddin, but just before I'd met him. And then again, the next time was in 2003. And that was also very striking because I came into the city in April, a few days after the Ba'athist regime was ousted with some of the Peshmerga. And we went to a building that had been used by the security services, and it was decorated with wallpaper, ugly wallpaper. And the Peshmerga commander with me started to peel the wallpaper off the wall. And I thought, why this act of vandalism? I mean, it was ugly, but is this the moment for redecorating your building? And underneath was what was scrawled was the messages and graffiti from people who'd been held prisoners there before they were deported to the South and murdered. It was really something, and he knew that was there. So, I'm very much aware of the history of Kirkuk. The last time I was there was with Dr. Najmuddin. I stayed with him just days after the Iraqi army abandoned the city, and he remained when Daesh was closing in and the city was saved. So what lessons can we take from other divided places? And I've been in a number. I was the first US ambassador to Croatia, which was a country at war between Croats and Serbs. I was at Dayton, where we celebrated the 25th anniversary yesterday of the agreement that ended the war in Bosnia. Again, a deeply divided place in East Timor as it emerged from Indonesia. And my last diplomatic assignment was in Afghanistan, another deeply divided country. All of these divided, like Kirkuk, along ethnic lines. So are there lessons that can be learned about how deeply divided communities or divided communities can work together? And the first point I'd make is one of the difficulties in divided communities, and this is certainly in Kirkuk, is there's always an element of a zero-sum game. One side wins, the other side loses. So Kirkuk, under the Iraqi constitution, is meant to have a referendum to determine whether it's remains part of Iraq, or becomes part of the Kurdistan region, which is both autonomous and, as I think many people recognize, will sooner or later become an independent country. So if you're in favor of being part of Kurdistan, then you win. And if you're opposed to being part of Kurdistan and the referendum turns out in favor of Kurdistan, you lose. And vice versa, if the referendum is held and the Kurdistan position loses, then if you're in favor of that, you favor of joining Kurdistan, you lose. This is a fundamental difficulty, and there's no easy solution to these kinds of zero-sum situations, but there are some things that can mitigate it. The first point is, for whatever the dominant group is, and usually in these arrangements, there's a dominant group numerically or by power. For example, in Croatia, the Croats over the ethnic Serbs. In Afghanistan, the Pashtuns numerically over the Tajiks and the Hazaras. One of the ways in which you can deal with that situation is for the stronger group to be very generous and inclusive of the weaker groups. Weaker, again, in the sense that they're not as numerous. And I must say, this is something that Najibuddin Karim did as governor of Kirkuk, and was very proud of doing, that made sure that everybody was included. And sometimes this means giving the less numerous group a larger voice than what they might deserve on the basis of population. In Croatia, this is done by giving the ethnic communities special seats in parliament. So the Serbs choose 3 members of parliament. They vote in the regular election, and then they can choose among different Serb candidates. Only Serbs can vote for those Serbian candidates. The Italian Croatians, which is a very small community, wouldn't get any representation based on a strict population basis. They get 1. And so it goes. Pakistan has a similar arrangement for Christians and Hindus and Sikhs. So this is a way to do that. Another way is to make sure that when you're constructing the government, that you include people from these different communities, so that if there's a Kurdish governor, for example, you have an Arab, a Turkmen, and a Christian deputy governor, even if the population numbers might not work out. You take decisions by consensus to the extent possible. You acknowledge everybody's symbols, the churches, the crescent for the Turkmens and the color, the Kurdistan flag, make sure the Iraqi flag flies, what's important for the Arabs. In some cases, you end up having to do partition, particularly if you're going to be dividing a place between two states, whether it's 2 sovereign states like Kashmir or a basically autonomous entity like the Kurdistan region and the rest of Iraq. So it may be possible to draw the border lines so that where you have Arab majorities or Turkmen majorities who do not wish to be part of the Kurdistan region, you can draw a line between the two. Or if they do want to be part of the Kurdistan region, you draw the line there. Of course, it's very important to consider economic resources to make sure that they're fairly distributed. And a place like Kirkuk with the enormous oil resources, I know one of the things that Governor Karim did was to get a part of a royalty, I think it might have been as much as $5 a barrel at one point, of the oil from Kirkuk to remain in Kirkuk, spent on the economic development of the province. And again, when that happens, it's very important that all the communities should be involved. You want to allow, it gets complicated when you get to the question of education. And this is a problem in Bosnia. Do you have separate schools and separate histories for each of the communities? That breeds separation. In Bosnia, there are radically different histories about the most important event to take place in Bosnia, which was the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 that started World War I. That event that led to the creation of modern Iraq, actually. Was it a terrorist act, as is taught by the Croat and Bosnian schools, or was it an act of national liberation? And when people come to such radically different histories, it's hard to keep them reconciled. On the other hand, you want to have a way for people in the schools to also express their own culture. So I would argue that maybe separate schools are not the wisest course of action, but arrangements where where for the Assyrian community, there's Christian education, Syrian language education, similarly for the Shiites and Sunnis, for the Kurds, and where different cultural issues are expressed, but at least where there's some common basis. But this is a very difficult issue to achieve. The final point I'd make is when we talk about self-government, in the 19th century and much of the 20th century, we had to think of this purely in territorial terms. You've got to draw a line on a map between different territories. But in the 21st century, the world is quite different. In cyberspace, there are not physical boundaries. And the way we travel, the way we live, they're not physical boundaries. So it's quite possible, for example, for Kurdish citizens of Kirkuk to be represented in the Kurdistan Regional Parliament. But if Turkmen and Arab citizens don't wish to be represented, then they wouldn't be. And this would be, of course, be circumstances in which Kirkuk was not territorially part of Kurdistan. So it's territorially a part of Iraq, of the federal Iraq, not part of the Kurdistan region, but nonetheless, you could allow the Kurdish citizens who want this to be able to have citizenship there. And again, this is a solution, for example, that exists in Bosnia, where Croats and Serbs each have citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also of Serbia or Croatia. It creates complications, but it is a way to satisfy those desires. And there are all sorts of other ways in which you can slice the idea of sovereignty to accommodate everybody. Again, at some point, and this is the difficulty in Kirkuk, there's going to be a decision as to whether Kirkuk is part of Kurdistan or part of Iraq. Again, I don't say that Kurdistan's going to be an independent country right now, although I think that almost certainly will happen sometime in the future, because one sees the will of the people of Kurdistan as expressed in the referendum, and in the end, you can't keep people in a country they don't want to be part of. But at the moment, they'll be part of the Kurdistan region or not. And that is that's a either or decision. So the question is, when that decision is made, if it's made, then how do you accommodate those who don't agree with it? And that is going to be the subject of a lot of work. I do think that the other aspect of this is to do what Najmuddin Karim did, which is not to focus on party, but to focus on good governance, on making the city and the province as good as it can be. And that is working on the very issues that the previous panel were talking about. Again, women's rights, education, cultural rights, electricity. And perhaps by focusing on those things, everybody can agree they want electricity. You might move away from a lot of these divisions. But sadly, we live in a very divided time where, and this really surprises me, where things like political party, begin to be more important than the greater good, even than your own country itself. And that's not just in Iraq, that's in places that you would never expect it, like the United States and the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Peter, for your input. Now we are going to turn into our second panelist, Kak Sarhang. Kak Sarhang, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you, Hannah and David, and thanks to the program on peacebuilding and human rights at Columbia University for hosting me. It is my pleasure to join this discussion and these distinguished panelists to reflect on peacebuilding in Kirkuk. At any moment, there are different angles and layers to matters of conflict and peace in Kirkuk. My comments will draw from 3 initiatives by the U.S. Institute of Peace, USIP, and they were implemented at different times of the over the past 10 years. As a disclaimer, neither USIP nor myself take a position on the political status of Kirkuk, so my comments will not focus on that. As USIP, we believe that peace is possible and peace is practical, and we believe that applies to Kirkuk as well. We often follow a bottom-up approach to peace building, while we also work on the national aspects of conflict and peace matters. So the first project that I would like to focus on is what we called, it was a project that was implemented in between 2010 and early 2013, and it was called Collaborating to Serve Kirkuk. As I'll talk about these projects, you will realize that it will hit on some of the themes that the previous speakers touched upon. So 2010, 2013, during that time, and some may that it's the same now, political divisions were deep, resulting in crippling government bodies and functions. The status of Kirkuk and the implementation of Article 140 of the Constitution was at the center of everything. Different groups were boycotting the provincial council. So as USIP, we worked on a government track and a civil society track, and we connected both. And we wanted to help the Kirkukis to cut through the stalemates and the distrust that existed and help them move to other practical matters on which common ground could be found. And interestingly, and connecting what happened to our colleague who lost the electricity and Ambassador Galbraith's point, we convened a series of facilitated dialogues, bringing together leaders from the different communities of Kirkuk, including provincial council members and members of parliament and civil society. We asked them what were the needs of the citizens of Kirkuk, regardless of identity, race, religion, and political affiliation. And the participants identified services as a key need, And among services, electricity was identified as the first priority to take action on. They agreed to lobby the Baghdad government to use Kirkuk's fair share of the petrodollar funds to procure electricity from a private provider in the Kurdistan region. The project became a convening platform while there were members who were boycotting official government and council sessions. The process rallied civil society organizations together, engaged them with the provincial and the national government, and this was an important moment. And again, in speaking of lessons learned, because engaging with civil society was important, because by that point, the role of civil society, especially in Kirkuk, was not accepted as it was, as it might be now. So by 2013, some key progress could be observed. Procuring electricity from the Kurdistan region was approved by the provincial, federal, and Kurdistan regional governments. Power cut in the summer dropped from 18 hours to 8 hours, and from 12 hours in springtime to 6 hours. But unfortunately, those gains, as we have seen on this call, have not been sustained. Our colleague Odisho lost power there, and he was talking about how bad it is in terms of electricity. A civil society working group was created at the time, and it was a compromise of about a dozen NGOs. They signed a memorandum of understanding with the provincial government on continued collaboration, regular meetings, and consultations, again, ensuring that civil society is part of governance and is not excluded. The second initiative that I want to talk about, it was a series of what we called justice and security dialogues, focused on bridging the relationship between the security and justice sector, as well as the local communities. The dialogue focused on certain districts inside Kirkuk city itself. The focus was on local police, judges, and the community. Some indicators of improvements that we have seen, that we'd seen at the time. Again, this was also between 2010 and 2013, another angle of the conflict or tensions that we looked at. In addition to police hotlines, police officers started offering their own phone numbers to civil society leaders and community leaders to contact them when there was a need. The police reported an increase in citizens visiting police stations and reporting issues. Again, another indicator of that the relationship between the two sides was coming together. The police welcomed human rights education from civil society, which was providing brochures listing human rights, and they organized training sessions for the police. Judges explained how the judicial process works to both police and the community, which was important to explain what constitutes evidence and due process. These showed that not all issues were stemming from politics or identity issues, or rather inefficiencies, limited capacity, and lack of knowledge as well. So obviously issues of politics and divisions existed, but it is important not to assign everything to that. These other matters were important. Local police criticized and applied pressure on other security agencies when they were performing raids without coordinating with the local police, because they felt that they were making progress with the community and they did not want the action of others to undermine that. And if we fast forward from 2013 to 2016, and our work on reconciliation in Hawija and Southwest Kirkuk, by that point, Hawija and the surrounding areas were under the control of ISIS. But the anti-ISIS campaign was building momentum, and there was hope that one day the area would be liberated. The provincial government and tribal leaders of Kirkuk requested the help of USIP with community reconciliation that would be necessary when Hawija would be liberated. Supported by USIP, our Iraqi partners, Senate for Peacebuilding and the network of Iraqi facilitators, led two back-to-back dialogue processes in 2016 and 2017, both before the liberation of Hawija, and succeeded in to reach two agreements. The second one was signed by over 100 tribal and government leaders from Kirkuk. The agreements focused on easing communal tensions, preventing revenge acts of violence, and enabling the return of displaced families. At its core was what Mustafa talked about, was how to deal with the community members perceived or were actual ISIS affiliates. The tribal leaders recognized the risk of pushing people outside their communities, increasing their vulnerability to radicalization, armed groups, and criminal organizations. That's why the terms of the agreement included reforms to their even own tribal code that would allow, to make sure that would allow for most people to go home, including not to give women as reparation in tribal deals, which was an important accomplishment. After liberation of Hawija, the tribes stood up to efforts by the security forces who went after certain families under the justification of being affiliated with ISIS. Hawija dialogue showed that the tribes want formal justice instead of tribal law as a mechanism to keep peace in their areas. They stressed that guilt will have to be proven by formal judicial institutions and not just accusations, and that is important. So in conclusion, what did we learn from these initiatives? It is true that there are certain issues that are somewhat unique to Kirkuk, stemming from its diverse communal composition, history with demographic change, and the dynamics of disputed territories, et cetera, et cetera. However, there's quite a bit that is common, that's common with the rest of Iraq in terms of public dissatisfaction with public officials, government services, security, unemployment, and other matters. In our experience, we have found that there are local leaders in government and outside government that can break through gridlock and can problem solve together. They do, however, need additional help to facilitate that. Civil society organizations can play an instrumental role as collaborative advocates rather than adversarial ones. They can serve as trainers of human rights, facilitators of dialogue, partners in solving problems, and keeping the tone civil and avoid violence. Civil society is a continuity factor because political fluctuations and elections may bring setbacks on the governmental side. And my last point is that we found that relationships could be transformed from doubt and lack of trust to hearing each other out, identifying collaboration mechanisms, partnerships, better treatment, trust, etc. Moving from seeing each other as a problem to a partner and part of a solution. But these initiatives that I mentioned and others need to be sustained and need to be scaled up. With that, I'll stop and I'll be happy to take questions after. Thank you.
Thank you, Kak Sarhang, for your remarks. Now we are going to turn into our last panelist, Ms. Lahib Higel. Lahib, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a privilege to be on the panel and be the last one, so I've had the opportunity to listen to all of you. I want to say first that the biggest inspiration is to listen to the young Kirkukis that I think very well expressed a desire to build their community based on some sort of Kirkuki identity, and they very well reflect how Kirkuk has a very particular dynamic and social cohesion as a province in Iraq, despite all of the turbulence that it has gone through over the years. I am not going to speak so much about either sort of community initiatives or status for Kirkuk or local peacebuilding initiatives. I'm going to focus more on governance and the possibilities for that, considering the quite restrictive political conditions that we have in Kirkuk and that many of the Kirkukis also alluded to. Just one thing that I would like to add to what Ambassador Galbraith mentioned earlier when it comes to the different options, and I think that this is also something that Najmuddin at some point was promoting was a third option between Kirkuk being a part of federal Iraq versus being a part of the Kurdistan region, and that is Kirkuk having some sort of status of its own as a region. I think this is still an option that is worth considering for Kirkuk in the future, especially considering how the communities, at least from what I have seen over the years, what they would like to see. And I think moving away from a very politicized nature that is imposed on its citizens, this might be a way forward, whatever the status looks like further into the future. But in any case, this is also for the moment, I think, pretty much out of reach, and I will explain why. So as Hannah mentioned before, I'm currently working for Crisis Group, but I have also worked on mediation initiatives on Kirkuk previously and still in some capacity. And the biggest sort of pattern that I notice is that every once in a while, there are dialogues that go on either between Kirkuki representatives, so parliamentarians. This has happened in several rounds under the leadership of UNAMI. And there are also, of course, negotiations that go on directly between Erbil and Baghdad when it comes to larger issues such as revenue sharing, such as security or governance or distribution of governance positions to some degree. When it comes to these dialogue efforts, in content, they usually address the main issues of that Kirkukis face daily, but also the issues that we have that are a consequence of the history that Kirkuk has gone through pre the Ba'athist regime, during the Ba'athist regime, and also afterwards with the 2003 invasion. These often relate to housing and land disputes. They relate to how do you best distribute administrative positions in a fair way? How do you make sure that each community has their fair share, as has been alluded to previously? And it also deals with questions of economy and access to livelihoods, among many other files, but I would mention these as the main ones. The problem that I've been seeing over the years is that each time the representatives come to some sort of agreement or near one, there is a political event that would stop them from actually signing an agreement. And to give you one example, very recently, 2 years ago, the Kirkukis managed to pass a new election law for Kirkuk that would allow Kirkuk to participate in provincial elections in Iraq, which it hasn't done for the last 3 elections. This was quite a big step forward. Unfortunately, the Iraqi parliament later decided to dissolve the provincial councils. Another event that obviously was very important recently was October 2017. So at the end of the military operations against Daesh, the Kurdistan region decided to hold a referendum in September. And in October, less than a month later, federal Iraq reimposed its control over Kirkuk, and the Peshmerga withdrew after essentially having been mainly in control for the past 3 years over the city, not Hawija, of course, and some of the adjacent areas. This caused a very serious political crisis between Baghdad and Erbil, between the two major Kurdish parties, the KDP and the PUK, and to some degree also on the local level. But what I would say, which again goes to this very specific dynamic of the Kirkuk communities, is that despite these political tensions, the local communities get along fairly well. They manage to deconflict many different issues that arise, socially and otherwise, also security to some degree. However, there are things that still remain to be resolved at a political level in order to provide safety, public services, etc. And what we've seen over the last year is conversations going on again between the Kirkuki representatives in parliament, but also directly between Erbil and Baghdad. Unfortunately, what tends to happen is that when Erbil and Baghdad cannot proceed on certain things, such as budget or security arrangements, other agreements that could potentially be implemented are also halted. So in these scenarios where politically we get stuck, but people are still in need of employment or more fair distribution within governance. We know that, for example, depending on who is in power, and I'm talking about parties, not necessarily so much an ethnic favoritism always. There tends to be a distribution within the government, the governmental institutions to benefit specific parties, for example. This is sometimes resolved by the one or the two communities that feel marginalized because of such policies. They would negotiate directly with their counterparts and they would find a solution. Other times, this is not possible. They would either, depending on who they are closer to, reach out to Erbil or to Baghdad to sort it out. Currently in Kirkuk, we have quite a serious vacuum, considering that the previous constellation that we had, which usually was a Kurdish governor, a deputy governor that is Arab, and a speaker or head of the provincial council, which is usually a Turkmen. Now that this constellation has been upset by the fact that we don't have a provincial council, and we have an acting governor who is an Arab, and a new one has still not been appointed, again due to disputes between Baghdad and Erbil, but also between the two major Kurdish parties. There is a serious vacuum where some people feel that they can benefit and other people won't. So what can we do in the meantime when we see that neither Baghdad or Erbil are really able to progress on this, and neither is parliament, or let's say that the rest of the Iraqi parliament does not pay sufficient amount of attention to the issues in Kirkuk? So what I believe and what I've seen over the years is that Kirkukis, again, if you actually manage to connect the bottom-up approaches that we have discussed here very much in depth, together with the top-down decisions, there is a greater possibility of actually making all, or at least most people included in governance. I'll give another example of issues that are perennial in Kirkuk, but that could potentially be resolved with some sub-steps until a greater bargain, let's say, has been reached between the political actors. And that is the housing and land disputes that especially become tense during harvesting season in Kirkuk every year. It is either lands that have been farmed by Arab families that used to belong to either Turkmen or Kurds, or the other way around, where let's say the Kurdish families who were displaced due to Arabization policies have come back to Kirkuk, but do not have the rightful, let's say, contract, for example, to farm that land and later harvest. So these are typical tensions that occur on a regular basis. Unfortunately, they sometimes lead to violent actions between people. Sometimes they are resolved by either side, either going to a judge, to their tribal sheikh, or finds another type of mediator that can go in between. So the housing and land disputes are supposedly to be resolved as a part of Article 140. I won't go into detail. I think that we have quite an informed audience when it comes to Article 140, but there are also a series of other laws that are supposed to regulate this. and to investigate the unlawful confiscation of lands that happened during Arabization, but also later on post 2003. This is for various reasons not happening. So the question is, what can be done today until a greater agreement is reached on this? There are certain technical steps that could potentially be pursued, such as the communities. And I think that I go back to some of the MPs who regularly sit down on these things. And generally, there is a consensus on how you deal with this, which is that when you've established that a piece of land or property belonged to a family, this should go back to that family, with whoever currently resides on the land being compensated for that. Now, in the case of many Arabs who have lived in Kirkuk for generations by now, the question is very much about, okay, so even if you are compensated, what happens next? And another obstacle in Iraq is that we have a very poor economic situation that would hardly support such a fund that would be needed for compensation, even though the plans for it exist. This goes back to how do we normalize, so to speak, or how do we reverse past policies? One of the foundational ideas would be that people are actually moved back to wherever they came from, for example. In many cases, this is not even possible. Again, we have had people that have lived in a governorate for several generations. One possibility could be, is it possible to compensate and at the same time provide alternative residency still within the governorate? I'm not talking about these things as if they are easy to resolve, obviously, but there are the frameworks to resolve the HLP issues exist. It could be possible to isolate such a file from other files in order to address it technically, and then start embarking on these, what they realize is a justice process that could actually help in the future as well, without necessarily connecting it to security agreements, economic agreements, budgets, etc., etc. There are many other examples, obviously. I chose this one because I think it's one of the more tangible ones. And it touches both on the local level and on the federal and subnational level. And what I would add as a last point to this is to say that there is an international community that has paid very much attention to Kirkuk, whether it has been for humanitarian reasons or political reasons. We know that there are countries that are heavily invested in Kirkuk, and they've been previously mentioned, such as Turkey, but also the US, with its currently doesn't have a military presence, but in any case, an important actor. But also Iran and a few others. One possibility is to actually create a group of sort of international guarantors that could help facilitate agreements on Kirkuk in a piecemeal way that doesn't interfere with what is stipulated to be implemented in the Constitution, and thereby I'm referring to Article 140 again. So a few ideas, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lahi, for your time. And I understand right now you're in Iraq, and last we spoke, you were traveling between cities. So I really appreciate your time to be here with us. Now, before we conclude this panel and move to questions, I'd like to invite David to give his final comments and thoughts. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much. And thanks to the panelists for terrific presentations. I'm going to reflect on the panel discussion, highlight some of the recommendations therein, suggest ways that Columbia University can support your interests. Then we're going to take questions from participants via the Zoom conference. And then in conclusion, I'm going to revert back to the first panel and make a specific proposal about something that can be done using media and focusing on women. But let me reply to the second set of interventions. Lahib, you focused on housing and land disputes. Columbia University's done a paper on power sharing in post-conflict settings. We used 20 case studies to illuminate different strategies and policies and programs. I'd like to share the paper with you and see if there's anything in there that would be useful to your work. This question of housing and land disputes is critical to resolving competing claims. So expect this paper from us. Sarhang, like the other panelists, you focus on the importance of dialogue. And you talked about your justice and security dialogue, the electricity issues dialogue. The need for dialogue, I think, is a recurring theme shared by the panelists in both the first and the second segments. So is the need for education. Sarhang, Columbia University has developed a human rights education. We did that in Myanmar. There are a lot of relevant procedures in this curriculum that I think would be useful to your work in Iraq. And if you wish, we'd be happy to provide the human rights curriculum to you. In addition to that, you talked about the return of displaced people. Now, this can either be a source of conflict, or if it's handled more properly, using dialogue as a way of taking on board the concerns of each of the communities, it can be a tool for conflict resolution. I'm a member of the Board of Governors of the IRC, the International Rescue Committee, which has some expertise in this area. And I'm going to look into whether or not there's a methodology that IRC has that could be shared with you that I think would be useful. And Peter, as always, thank you for a great presentation. You touched on many of the key issues in our power sharing study, encompassing governance, economy, and culture. You also made a specific recommendation about developing a system for sharing, for retaining and then sharing oil wealth from Kirkuk. Given your experience in East Timor and the negotiations that you led on oil and gas development in the Timor Gap, I think that this idea is particularly salient, and we'd invite you at Columbia if you wanted to develop those ideas further and publish them and make them available to Iraqis to use our program for that purpose. You've got some hands-on experience that I think would be extremely useful. So that's some feedback on my side. Let me turn to questions that we've received from participants. And participants who are online who want to submit a question, feel free to do so at this time. So we have an intervention from Masroor Mohaldin, who is a former member of the Human Rights Commissioner. He highlights the marginalization that different communities feel, discrimination that has been institutionalized that undermines their interests. And he asks if there are any remedies that you all recommend to address this marginalization. So let me put that question to the three persons in the second panel. Peter, since you started off, maybe we'll ask you if there's a way of mitigating the sense of marginalization and the resentment and potential conflict that arises from that.
I think it's very important that to avoid to figure out ways to avoid communities from feeling marginalized. One of the issues in many conflicts, but certainly the one in Croatia when I was there, was that the ethnic Serbs had been a considered a people, a Natia, a nation within Croatia. So Croatia had been a country of two nations, Croats who were about 85%, Serbs who were 12%. When Croatia became independent, they became a minority. And a little hard, I think, for Americans to understand these concepts, but to them it was very important. So is there a way to accommodate the desire of each of these communities to feel that they are full participants? And different countries have different solutions to that. Lebanon, actually, also Iraq, there's a kind of Lebanon's more formal, Iraq it's informal. In Lebanon, the president's a Maronite Christian, the prime minister is a Sunni, the speaker of the assembly is Shiite. Iraq, it's president's a Kurd, the prime minister is a Shiite, and the speaker of the parliament is a Sunni. Are there ways that you can represent each of the, and it's not entirely successful in either country, I want to emphasize, but are there ways that you can make each community feel that they are co-equal participants? And again, I think it's some of the points I already mentioned, but decisions by supermajority or consensus, everybody's national holidays and events are honored, everybody's flags can fly. I didn't mention, but should have, the police represents each of the communities, perhaps also with specific police dealing with specific issues in a particular community. It may be either you have a completely secular, a civil code on personal status, or you end up in it with a system in which each community has its own rules on personal status. But whatever you do, you try to avoid one community's position from dominating the others. And so I think that is the key to it. I mean, there's a lot that could be said about it. And again, the fundamental difficulty in Kirkuk remains, is it part of Kurdistan or not? I certainly think Najmuddin Karim's idea of having a separate region for Kirkuk has and still has a lot of merit, especially if the regional constitution can incorporate ways to represent each of these communities.
Peter, on your last point, the Vatican is a good model for a sovereign entity with special attributes. So there are examples that we can refer to. The Vatican may not be a perfect example. I'm assuming that's your reaction from your smile.
Well, I was thinking it was perhaps a bit weak on women's issues and equality of women.
But there are models that we can draw on, and I think we should study them. Tarang, why don't we turn to you and give you a chance to answer this question and provide any feedback?
Thank you so much. So thank you first for your comments and the offers. Definitely welcome sharing notes and lessons with you, whether through Colombia or the did you say the ICRC or the International?
The IRC.
IRC, sorry. Yes, definitely. As USIP, our focus is mostly on the most difficult aspects of return. So return is not the primary business or focus of USIP, but when return, there are barriers to return that destabilize. That's an angle that we are focused on. But to the question of marginalization, and I want to give a shout out to Mr. Masroor Aswad, who asked the question in comments, that he was actually the partner that USIP worked with in our justice and security dialogues in 2010 to 2013, and then other projects of the like in the rest of Iraq. I think that I would like to broaden the concept of what marginalization means and what inclusion means, and it could mean different things to different people. The three examples that I mentioned, making sure that when there were certain members of society attending the provincial councils and others were boycotting, we made sure that the dialogue process that we offered, somebody else comes in and makes sure that certain elements of society will not fall off the radar and they are still part of the process. So that's one way to ensure inclusion. The other one, when I mentioned that civil society was not part of the model of governance in Iraq, and it has been a journey since 2003 for the rest of Iraq and since 1992 in the Kurdistan region, is that how do you make sure that civil society and representatives of communities are represented in political dialogue and governance discussions, allocation of budget, et cetera, et cetera. So that's another aspect of inclusion and ensuring that marginalization doesn't happen. When we did the justice and security dialogues, it was important that there were issues of marginalization within even the police force. And Mr. Masroor would remember that some of the police officers felt that they were ignored by the state and they are just thrown at issues of terrorism while they have family issues, they have compensation issues, they have out there, their interests were not represented. They felt pretty much marginalized and other security actors were dominating. When marginalization, the example of ISIS that I mentioned in southwest Kirkuk and Hawija and other places, marginalization could happen as a new development, which the conflict of ISIS brought its dimension of marginalization. We have seen at the broader community level in Kirkuk, we have seen that political swings in terms of events affects who is marginalized and who is dominating. So that's, I think Iraq itself has a lot of experience in terms of where it was inclusive, it did well. I think by 2012, 2013, Kirkuk was going in the right direction of focusing away from the politics, being inclusive, focusing on services and the needs of the citizens. But ISIS and the economic crisis that followed significantly diminished that. And my last comment is also marginalization could mean from the perspective of the communities itself. And the youth feel marginalized, and ensuring that now that we see the protest movement in Iraq, that we ensure that the political processes, elections, and other matters bring them into the fold. And the last, actually now this last my point to what Odisho mentioned, is that marginalization for the indigenous people of Iraq who feel that there is an existential threat to their existence in the country takes a lot of other dimensions, not just that marginalized, they feel that existing in the country is at risk. So making sure that they are part of the governance processes, that actually there is education. And here I cite what USIP has done with what's called the Alliance of Iraqi Minorities, a coalition of 19 organizations representing the diversity of the different components of Iraq, Christians, Yazidis, Sabian Mandaeans, Shabak, Gurifeli, and others, where they work with the government in Baghdad and the government in the Kurdistan region to make sure that these stereotypes that our other colleague, I'm blanking out on her name, at the moment in the first panel, Enas or Enas, sorry, I'm mispronouncing your name, that the Iraq's curriculum would be reviewed, where you make sure that text and education about these other communities are reflected, and that education is provided to the Iraqi society. So marginalization has a practical element of it, but also whether you are in the process or not, and there are these other processes, whether your flag is flying as Ambassador Galbraith mentioned, or you feel that the education system represents you. So there are different elements of it. And sorry, I went too long, but yeah, over.
One of your areas of expertise in the Institute's work is in security. So let me just underscore some points that you made. Police should be drawn from the communities that they serve. When it comes to the administration of justice, people should have the ability to present their views or grievances before a judge in their own native language. This fits into a broader set of issues on security and cultural rights, but I think it's particularly salient, and I just wanted to underscore it. Lahib, let's hear your views about how to avoid marginalization, and then we've got a number of other questions in the queue, so we're going to try to move forward quickly.
Thank you. There were a lot of good inputs right before, so I'll keep it short, and I'll speak about the generational marginalization rather than ethnic or sectarian, which we tend to focus on in Iraq. I think the conference that we had today specifically highlights this in a sense that there is a younger generation in Iraq that is politically astute, that has new visions for the country that they want to live in, and they can have a lot to offer when it comes to new political solutions. So I think that in my role, and I think in many other people's role here, we should really take into account how we can actually feed in those ideas to the decision makers of today, which represent a time in Iraq that is very much different from the reality that we live in today. Thanks.
We're going to move on to another question, but first I stand corrected. The idea of revenue sharing means that both sides benefit. Peter's corrected me. At the end of the day, Timor ended up with 100% of the revenue, and Australia didn't get any. So it's really not a good model for us to consider or to study further. But the question of revenue sharing as a broader concept is worth some further consideration. We have a question from Asa Amin Shwan. And I think, Peter, this is directed to you. You mentioned that Kurds in Kirkuk should be able to be represented in the Kurdistan Regional Parliament, even if Kirkuk remains under federal control. He asked you to elaborate on that. Quote, I don't see the point to be represented in a parliament that has no jurisdiction on where you live. Peter.
Okay, let me first say, am I muted? No.
No.
First say, I think there's one word that sums up how you deal effectively with different communities, and that is communities that are divided ethnically, religion, or generationally. And that is to be fair, fairness. And what really causes division, in my experience, is where a community feels it's been treated unfairly. I think this is very much the case in the majority now in Scotland that favors independence. They feel that the Brexit process in proceeding with this, the English and Boris Johnson and the Tories simply ignored their sentiments. And therefore they were unfairly treated. And even if it might not be in their interest, economic interest, to go for independence, a majority favors that. And I think you see this in so many different cases. So when we think about any situation, is there a way that we can make each of these communities feel that they're fairly treated? And one way, especially since Article 140 specifies that there should be a referendum. And of course, if you're a Kurd in Kirkuk or a Kurd in the or you're the KRG, you can say right now, things have been totally unfair. This was supposed to have been held by the December 31st, 2007. The referendum has not been held. So are there ways around it? Well, one way is to give citizens of who wish it, or Kurdish citizens of Kirkuk, if you will, the right to participate in the Kurdistan parliament, to vote, to elect representatives, to hold citizenship, if you will, of the Kurdistan region. Of course, the ability to go and live there. And for example, you can have a number of extraterritorial operations. There could be Kurdish schools. There could, or schools, Kurdistan regional school system that Kurds might participate in. There could be a university that's run by the Kurdistan region, or a branch of a university from the Kurdistan region that operates within Kirkuk. There could be, again, in cooperation with the other communities, not unilaterally, some police that have a connection to the Kurdistan region. Obviously, there have been, and may well be again in the future, Peshmerga, who are responsible to the KRG. Well, if you have Peshmerga as your security, or Asaish who as your security forces, perhaps it would be a good idea for you also to have a voice in it. And I realize that certainly when I talk about education, that goes a little contrary to something else I'd said about trying to have at least some element of a common educational system. But these are ways in which having a voice, even if you don't have, you're not part of the territory, being part of that community can help. It can also help psychologically, and it is done in a number of countries where people who of the ethnicity but who are not part of the ethnic homeland do have a voice. And finally, just to come back to your point about the revenue sharing, David, the reason that Australia was completely shut out in the end of any part of the oil revenues in the Timor Sea is that it had no legitimate claim whatsoever. To give Australia even 10%, which is what we negotiated in 2000, was unfair to East Timor, and eventually Australia accepted that. So if you want to have a claim to something, you have to have some right to it. There has to be something that's fair about it.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, other panelists in the second segment. Before we revert to the panelists from the first segment, I just want to make a point about leadership. We focused on programs and policies, but reconciliation is really driven by enlightened leadership. And I had the opportunity to spend a day once sitting in the office of Governor Karim. He welcomed petitioners, Assyrians, Arab sheikhs, Turkmen, and he spent a considerable amount of time listening to their concerns. And even though I didn't understand what was being discussed, I could tell without equivocation that every group left that meeting feeling as though their views had been heard, and with assurance from Governor Karim that they'd be acted upon. So we can talk about technical details, but ultimately reconciliation and countering marginalization needs to be driven by political leaders. And I would hope in the future that Kirkuk would have political leaders who share the same values as Governor Karim and are able to act to advance this goal of reconciliation. Now, let me just now spend a couple minutes talking about our first panel before we adjourn.
Sorry, David, may I interrupt for 1 second for a quick clarification? Just to make sure, I probably, Ambassador, my point probably did not come across clearly. I am for standard education, and I think that is the right way to go. I was making the point that that standard education needs to be representative, where there is education about the religious figures, the literary figures, the history of the different communities of Iraq represented, so that they know about each other. That was the point I was stressing. So I don't think my point and the ambassadors were in contradiction, if I understood them correctly.
Saran, thanks for clarifying. The paper that I'll send to you on power sharing and post-conflict communities deals extensively with educational issues, not just curriculum, but the educators themselves, the educational facilities, language use. So I'll provide that to you and the other panelists, and I think you'll find that it's instructive around some of the priorities that you and USIP have identified. Before we adjourn, just let me take a quick moment to reflect on the discussion from our first panel. We heard concerns from Odisho about the systematic marginalization of Christians. Columbia University's prepared a study, an action plan on countering the marginalization of Christians in Iraq. And Odisho will share that with you, as well as with the other panelists. We did that in cooperation with the Chaldean Community Foundation of Detroit, and I think that there are some important findings and recommendations. I noticed in the first panel that there were some cross-cutting themes that all the panelists agreed to. Let me just state them here, and if the panelists want to weigh in and elaborate, of course, they're welcome. Each of the panelists talked about the importance of dialogue, and I've always framed that as contact, communication, and cooperation. So dialogue for dialogue's sake has limited value unless it results in a practical result where people find ways of working together and overcoming this negative stereotyping of the other. The other cross-cutting theme had to do primarily with women, but also with youth. So let me just ask members of the first panel if they subscribe to this view, that two important touchstones were dialogue and the role of women. If there's no objection, then I'd like to make a specific proposal as to ways that Columbia can work with these community representatives. You identified several thematic concerns: jobs, essential services like electricity, security, governance and addressing corruption, the damage that's done through hate speech, enabling religious identity. So here's what I'd like to propose. Columbia University would like to interview women from the key communities in Kirkuk and ask for their views around each of those topics. Those interviews can be packaged and broadcast. We have Odisho from Kirkuk TV. There might be an opportunity to have a series of dialogue productions where the views of women from Kirkuk are shared over the television or via the internet. So what do members of the first panel think about this? Are those topics correct? Would you welcome the opportunity for a facilitated dialogue on camera? And then what about the outlet for those recordings? Is Kirkuk TV suitable? Should we think about Rudaw? Columbia University's website could also be used. So let me leave those questions with our first panelists and see how they react. Maggie, can we give the first panelists a chance to respond?
Yes, sure. Give me 1 second.
How's it going, Maggie, getting a camera on them?
Well, I'm trying to work with them, but I'm not sure. I'm trying to unmute them, but I'm not sure if they're ready to make some remarks. So give me 1 second.
So rather than go through the cumbersome process of giving them the chance to respond, I think it's pretty clear that we can agree that dialogue is a good idea, that women's issues are important, and that women's voices should be heard, and that we should amplify them. I think that what Columbia will do is to prepare a project memo that describes this initiative, identifies the themes and the topics, and then we can work with the panelists to see how they view it and how they want to participate. Particularly Enas, who had a lot to say on this subject. And we'd welcome your feedback as well as feedback from the other participants. And of course, this event is about partnerships between the communities in Kirkuk and well-intended international organizations. We've heard a lot from international representatives who bring a lot of capacity and understanding to the table. So we'd welcome from the second panelists your feedback on this idea of a dialogue among women on key issues for female Kirkukis. So why don't we prepare a paper to that effect? We'll share it with everyone. We also have committed to send to you some of our curriculum and our research papers, which we'll do in short order. And we pledge to adjourn this session at 10:20 Eastern Standard Time. We're 2 minutes shy of that, but I think we're at a convenient point to acknowledge the terrific contributions from both panelists, the on-the-ground and field perspectives from our first panelist talking about community perspectives, the sort of macro policy perspectives from our second panel, from Peter looking at international experience, from Sarhan looking at Iraqi experience, and from Lahib, who looked at the administrative structures within Kirkuk. So all of this is moving towards a more comprehensive approach. To date, peace building has been done in a rather ad hoc fashion. Each of our organizations is working on it. We as individuals are working on it. We talked at the outset about peace building wasn't just an institutional process, it was also a personal transformative process. And I hope that in the future that we continue to evolve as individuals, that institutions stay engaged and support the work of individuals, including their own individual transformation. These are critical goals for Kirkuk, for other parts of Iraq. I think in the memory of Governor Karim, we feel obligated to serve the people of Kirkuk, to make sure that they have a voice, to amplify their concerns, and to marshal our resources and our expertise to try to address the challenges that we've identified. So for a very rich and full discussion, I want to express my gratitude and appreciation to all the panelists. I want to thank my colleagues, Hannah Sita and Prusha Hasan, for organizing and managing the discussion so ably. We're at a moment where we can adjourn, we can take a breath and focus on things that we want to do in the future individually and together. And we hope that this discussion fosters partnerships internationally and locally so that we can address some of the key concerns that exist in Kirkuk and help Kirkuk become peaceful, prosperous, and stable. So let me say my thank you, my shukran, kakspas. Thank you all for everything. We're going to adjourn here, and you'll hear from us shortly with a paper and some research findings. So have a good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for all being together.